Have you ever wondered how a whole country with millions of different people, all with their own ideas and interests, can possibly come together to form one single nation? I mean, think about it. It sounds like chaos, right? It's like trying to play a game with no rule book. Well, how do they agree on that ultimate rule book? That's exactly what we're going to dig into.
You know, a huge clue is actually hiding in plain sight. It's right here on the Great Seal of the United States. You've probably seen this phrase 1,000 times, maybe even on the money that's in your pocket right now. It's that little Latin motto clutched in the eagle's beak, E pluribus unum. So what does it mean? E pluribus unum is Latin for out of many, one. Now, back in the day, it meant something very specific. 13 separate colonies coming together to create one new nation. But the idea behind it is so much bigger than that. It's this beautiful concept of forging a single, unified whole from a ton of different parts. But an idea like that, as powerful as it is, doesn't just happen. It needs a blueprint, a master plan to actually turn all that many into one.
So how do you do it? You do it with a really special kind of document, a blueprint for an entire nation, the ultimate rule book that lays out the whole game. You do it with a constitution.
Okay, so what is this thing really? If we strip away all the fancy legal jargon and the centuries of history, what is a constitution at its very core?
At its most basic, it's the foundational set of rules. It literally defines what a country is, what it stands for, how the laws get made, and who has the power to make them. You can almost think of it as the source code for a country's entire operating system.
Now, when you picture a constitution, you probably think of a single bound document, right? And for most countries, like the US, that's exactly what it is. It's codified all in one place. But that's not the only way to do it. Some countries, like the United Kingdom, have an uncodified constitution. Their rules are drawn from a whole mix of different laws, court rulings, and just long-standing traditions. So you have two very different paths to get to the same destination, establishing the rules of the game.
In this, right here, this gets to the absolute core of why constitutions even exist. It's not just about setting up a government and giving it power. It's also about controlling that power. Scholar Scott Gordon put it perfectly. He said constitutions have institutionalized mechanisms of power control. In other words, a constitution isn't just a rule book for the citizens, it's a rule book for the rulers themselves. Now, this idea of a rule book for the people in charge, it's not some modern invention. Not at all. To find its origins, we have to go way, way back, thousands of years before modern countries even existed.
You know, this human impulse to write down the rules is just ancient. We're talking over 4,000 years ago. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Uruk-agena was trying to protect widows and orphans. Then you have Draco's Code in ancient Athens, and of course, Rome's famous 12 tables. For thousands of years, we've been trying to put justice down on paper.
But most of these early codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, were basically just big lists of laws, like if you do this, this is your punishment. But then the ancient Greeks came along, and they started asking a totally different and frankly a much deeper question. What's the best way to even structure a government in the first place?
And the guy who really gets credit for this is Aristotle. He was one of the very first thinkers to draw a clear line between everyday laws and what he called constitutional law, the big rules that determine the whole arrangement of the offices in a state. He studied all these different ways to govern and came to the conclusion that the best system was a mix of different types. A blueprint that, believe it or not, still echoes in many of our modern democracies. Now, for centuries after the Greeks, this idea of a rule book for rulers kind of went dormant. Kings and emperors were pretty much seen as being above the law. But then, in medieval England, something happened. A major shift was coming, all thanks to one incredible document. This is the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was literally forced on King John of England by a bunch of rebellious barons way back in 1215. And it established a principle that was, for its time, absolutely revolutionary. The king was not all-powerful. He, too, had to play by the rules. And you have to just listen to the power in these words from Article 39. This is the direct ancestor of what we now call due process of law. It's the bedrock of individual freedom, a promise from the state that it can't just throw you in jail or take your stuff on a whim. And from here, this idea that power really comes from the people and must be limited by law, it just catches fire. It explodes during the Age of Enlightenment and kicks off the modern constitutional era that we all live in today. And let me tell you, These modern rulebooks come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, all shapes and sizes. On one end, you've got the Constitution of India. It is the longest in the world, a massive document with over 117,000 words. And on the other end, the US Constitution, which is the shortest. It's a pretty stark reminder that there's no single right way to build a nation's rulebook.
But even though they can be so different, most modern constitutions are built from the same basic Lego bricks. They usually start with a preamble, which is just a fancy way of saying a mission statement, like, we the people. They're entrenched, meaning they are deliberately made really hard to change. They set up a separation of powers between different branches of government, so no one group gets too powerful. And maybe most important of all, they almost always include a Bill of Rights that spells out the fundamental freedoms of the citizens, freedoms that the government can't take away.
Okay, but here's the thing, and it's maybe the most critical question of all. What happens when the words written on the page don't match up with the reality on the ground? Well, there's this really smart idea from a political theorist named Giovanni Sartori. He talked about the difference between a real constitution and what he called a facade constitution. For instance, the old Soviet Union actually had a constitution that, on paper, guaranteed freedom of speech, but in reality, it was just a facade, a worthless piece of paper that was totally ignored by the authoritarian government. And that really gets to the truth of it, right? A constitution isn't just ink on some fancy old parchment. Its real power, its only power, comes from the collective will of a society, the people and their government, to actually live by its rules, to respect its limits, and to defend its principles, especially when it's hard. It's a contract, a deal a society makes with itself.
Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If a constitution is basically a promise a whole society makes to itself, what are you supposed to do when that society changes? When its values, its technology, its very identity evolves over time? How does a fixed rulebook stay relevant in a world that never stops changing? Well, that's a question that every single generation has to figure out for itself.